Good morning. It's kind of blows me away. I been looking at this that caught my attention was this issue came up in Texas about all these articles about how cloud seeding didn't cause the flooding in Texas, and um, they you read into the story about further and find out that there was actually worse cloud spraying operations in Texas uh, a couple of days beforehand, and so basically the journalists go around and they go to the company that's spraying and say, "Oh, did you do this?" And they go, "No, no, no, we weren't even spraying at that time." And then that becomes the end of the story. That's their sole level of investigation, investigating the companies in question. Now, the thing is, once you start to actually read a little bit into the techniques of cloud seeding, which the first thing is, when they turn around and attack people for suggesting that potentially weather has been manipulated, the first thing to remember is that I wrote an article about this, about the polar stern. Like, my argument was, it was 2009, because it's the same, 2009, 2010, because it's the same year that they actually had a symposium on geoengineering at Te Papa Conference. And if you put geoengineering and looking at Victoria University, Waikato University, you find there's actually quite a bit of academic study going into it. Now, the first thing is, up until that point, the element was chemtrails isn't actually taking place. No, that's all science fiction and conspiracy, lunacy, blah blah blah. And there are lots and lots, massive amounts of newspaper articles saying that if you believe in cloud seeding or chemtrails, you're a lunatic. But here we have in 2009, 2010, they had the experiments saying, well, this could be a potential way to actually affect the planet. Now, the first thing is, when I spoke to a lot of these guys through Te Papa themselves, I said, well, okay, see, these are theoretical, I get it, but they must have been based on prototypes and mathematical modelling. Well, you're right. Okay, so who did it? And then they all went, I think there's some stuff vaguely being done in the Tasmania in the 1950s. So I went looking, and to cut a long story short, from the 1950s up to the 1980s, New Zealand and Australia, there is actually a staggering amount of military operations carrying out for experimental scientific purposes that get taken place in that area. For example, crowflight is one of them. And this is a very important one too, because what was happening is the flights were basically taking place between Tasmania, South Australia, and New Zealand, pretty much out beyond the 12-mile economic exclusion zone. So when you file an official information act to the government saying, are you doing cloud seeding in New Zealand? And they come back and go, no, they're not actually lying technically, because operations are not technically taking place. So the wording for an OIA that probably needs to be filed, and I'll think about it and work on it, but something along the lines of, is New Zealand involved in any experiments, practical or research-based wise, that are launched from New Zealand or Australian areas. So the idea is you have to be very specific, and I've played this game with them. They're very, they become very pedantic about the way you're wording. Like, I had one where I was doing experiments involved, well, not experiments, a military exercise where they were using new technology to be able to see through walls, and New Zealand and I knew they were doing it, we were involved in it, and in fact, and they kept on saying, no, we're not involved, it's not happening in New Zealand, it's not happening in New Zealand. It was only when I clicked on the fact that actually the exercise that where it was actually taking place was in the UK, and New Zealand was sending its people over to participate, then I kind of got an honest answer from them. So, the devil is in the details, my friends. So first of all, the first issue was that they were going to the source, and the second aspect was they weren't really going to go out in a lot of trouble to actually understand the science, which they were denying. And this is denying something that they were saying for years didn't exist. So already the school board is people critiquing the government, saying the government doesn't always play honest. Case in point again, Dow Chemicals, Operation Popeye Motorpool and Mud or Lava Commando, all carried out very detailed cloud seeding / chemtrail seeding operations in Vietnam. And again, very interesting, because what they used was the science. You had to understand the whole process to understand how it worked, which required actually a bit of study and detail and getting to be familiar with the chemical reactions and thermodynamics. And the reality was, in those particular operations, that they were actually often mixing different chemicals. So you would be spraying stuff in there to spark the silver iodine, to spark the rain, and then at the same time, the same area on the ground would be sprayed with industrial emulsifiers that were designed to encourage erosion and degradation. Case in point, we now call that stuff today, modern version of that is called Corex, very much like the stuff that was sprayed all up and down the Hawke's Bay coast after the MV Rena, gets in the soil, stays for years. When they went off into the testing afterwards about the chemical damage on the chemicals on the MV Rena, not only was the maritime agencies, every time I found a new chemical, which they said, from Official Information Acts and a bit of on-the-ground investigation as well, they would then keep constantly changing their website. So I'm catching them out on a lie. But the key thing was they weren't actually also testing for the things that they were spraying to alleviate the Rena. So we still don't really know what the consequence of that Corex all and up and down that particular area. So the next step was that in 2009, 2010, so all these people saying vehemently, people like Ross Marsden from NIWA, constantly go out there and troll people all the time, and until the point I said, well, Ross, it's a bit funny, you'll say that this technology is all lunacy and all made up and doesn't exist, and your own organisation is actually holding a symposium. And that was pretty much the last time we had heard from Ross Marsden. He disappeared and it turned out that the guy that is only basically a weather maker wasn't as fully in depth in the levels of NIWA's upper echelon as he was making out. Funny that. Again, I've seen over the years a number of people that are affiliated with the military, industrial complex, with intelligence agencies will get sent to troll people on their sites. And it's a case of, they're exploiting the fact that people don't know the full science to make it out like to dismiss them. But when you actually start challenging them back on actually knowing the science, they back down real bloody quick. So, what was also happening is the polar stern, and that was a ship-based. It was the same thing as chemtrails, but they were doing it from a ship. And it turned out, I was just looking today, and I'm actually quite staggered, because there's nearly between 8 and 12 of these experiments carried out, and it was very much, again, very, very much the scientific academic community that was aware of it was going, you've got to be expletive explaining that it could cause toxic algae bloom. And again, this gets later on, it gets debunked or dismissed, but it's sort of like oh no, we're not really spraying that much. But this is like the argument that they roll out for radiation. Oh, radiation, a little bit of radiation doesn't hurt. The reality is nobody knows what the long-term or consequence of it. And it's the same with the silver iodine. We know that it is a very toxic material, and that it can. I mean, the key thing is that you spray it in an area where animals come along and we talk about little microscopic animals, and they end up digesting the stuff, and then they actually basically die because they're not meant to be eating the stuff, and then their bodies effectively rot and compose, and you end up with a chain reaction, which is what can trigger algae bloom, and again with whether it will infect it. So again, you don't have to be a climate change denier or a climate change zealot. It's actually relevantly moot. At the end of the day, this technology, all it's doing is amplifying what is already existing. So if there is climate change occurring, it's going to amplify that. And if it's not, it's going to amplify whatever existing weather conditions. So somehow thinking that believing geoengineering means that you're a climate denier, not necessarily, but at the same time, the same level, people are talking about, you say, well, this is a way that we could manipulate the weather, and we're finding that a lot of the people that are already doing it to begin with come from the military industrial complex, and there is very little oversight or study. We just don't know, because they were never required to do that, so they went ahead and did it anyway. Again, on these operations that are occurring by ship in the southern oceans, is that they're taking place in the case of international waters. So we really, that you write an OAA, you're not going to get a lot of information, because they're actually operating almost like pirates. And what I was, a lot of these occur in the subantarctic area. And what I've actually now been reading about today from different research and the literature is that you can be carrying. In fact, there are papers about what are the cloud seeding effects of the subantarctic, and they don't explain how it's been done or where they just talk about the reaction, and it's very written in a very scientific way, so that unless you know the science, you're not really, what I'm trying to say is that they're not saying, oh, Bob jumped up in an airplane and flew this many. It's just like, here's the paper, this is what's occurring, but they're not explaining how it took place. But it is taking place, and what occurs to me is a lot of the weather patterns that we're seeing in South Australia now, they literally blow in off from Antarctica. So effectively, you can sort of prime it there, where you're out of our eyes of any accountability, and just let it rip. Now, in South Australia, this is where, again, all this algal bloom is specifically taking place, and people are wanting royal inquiries. They want to know, and they have, again, it's the role model. They bring out scientists and so on, and they say, oh, well, mystery solved, it's blah, 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 blah. But they still actually haven't answered how blah, 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 blah actually suddenly became occurring. Like, oh, because of climate change reaction. And again, that's actually not, they're not citing a scientific study. They're citing an opinion, but because that person has an expertise or a doctorate, suddenly they become, they're misrepresenting these qualifications. These people are actually talking about stuff that they should stick to their knitting and stay in their alleyway, but they suddenly become, stick a microphone and suddenly they become the almighty expert. And it becomes a misrepresentation of what academia is actually meant to be about. In context, what I find that very interesting is that the areas that they're talking about, where that it's occurring, like things like Dentworth River, we see in 2016 they got caught spraying over a dam while it was actually flooding, and enough to the point that the farmers and the Premier William Hodgkins were saying, we're going to have an inquiry into this, and then it just slipped away. And the inquiry, no more information about it. And then 7 years later, they're talking about a similar condition, and they use that story. So, oh no, that's happening. That was debunked. It's not happening. No, that's all conspiracy theory. But what they actually did was they inserted an event from 7 years previously that had context, there's no relation to that story at all, to misrepresent what was actually going on. So that's not just shitty journalism. That is deliberate manipulation of the information flow. Now, also, going back to the Texas argument, so in Texas, they'll go around saying, oh, this is not happening where we're in Spain. And then you go to California, and then you go to Dubai, and the same stories, these new particular articles would come up time and time again. Now, again, I found a very detailed, and I'll put the link when I put up the next shipping news, I'll put the link in there. I found a very detailed paper from 2009, and actually detailing that actually the cloud seeding that they were doing in Dubai was exacerbating flooding conditions. And again, this is written from academics, whereas the people that turn around saying beforehand, oh, no, they're just journalists sticking a microphone under someone's nose, like the company that's doing the spraying, and they say, no. And then other experts jump in who, as we saw in the Wuhan case, basically Peter Dasnick reached out to effectively, I think it was about 15 or so academics, and they all had conflict of interest. They all had somehow one way or another linked into the gain of function area. So then they started writing stories dismissing the idea that COVID could come from a laboratory situation, which was then drip-fed to Pacific media, who then proved that story. And then once they created that media landmine, all the other mainstream media would jump in and just take that verbatim as the truth. When what we now know was that actually that was a public relations exercise, and they were deliberately spinning the truth to deflect away from the fact that Wuhan. And so this is a similar situation that we've got going with the cloud seeding situation, is that the possibility of those companies, which is Rainmaker in America, which is linked to Peter Thiel, who also is involved in Privatised Weather, or Tomorrow I.O., and there's, I think, Howard Lutnick. Howard Lutnick, by the way, is next door neighbour to Epstein, and he was also, like Donald Trump, first in the Clinton camp when Epstein was creating the designing the system for the global initiative would allow them to effectively launder the money. Very similar to the system that you see in the Robin Hood Foundation as well. So Ludnick was again tied up all these particular companies that are very much into the whole idea of privatising the weather. So only if you're a big boy, you have access to know all that information. So it's kind of like the Mayan sun gods, basically. Like, they're the only ones that actually know how the Mayan sundial works. So they get to pay all powerful, and everyone else bows down to them because they're the gatekeepers of knowledge. And that's basically what these companies, who are also heavily involved in massive land grabs, all throughout the area. And again, it's what we're seeing is other technology like geospatial mapping. Pardon me, bit of a hay fever this morning. Geospatial mapping, which is carried out by companies in New Zealand, and there's similar in Australia. Near Maps Aviation Action, and that was his CEO, was one of the guys that went down in the Titanic submarine, and there was like basically I did a story at one point about like all these guys that were billionaires tied up with massively kind of AI, sort of almost minority reporting AI, which required huge amounts of zeros and ones, kind of things that you need really smart mathematicians like Hawkins and all those sort of people, mathematicians that Epstein was actually inviting to his island because for some reason he was really interested about wanting to know about super physics, which I said, all these things are involved in quantum computing, cryptocurrencies. So, all of this has huge power. And also, with it, you gain huge ability for huge insider trading. Case in point, and during the Hawke's Bay, the forestry had been allowed to privatise, so they stopped clearing their forestry slash, which also had issues with the soil, and again, God knows what else had been spraying in those forestry areas. It'd be very good to do some detailed chemical analysis of that area, but however, they created the slash, didn't clean it up. Then when the flooding came through, it basically wiped out all these residential areas, very much like it's doing in Motuwake, and similar accidents are happening all around the world. Now, in the case of the Hawke's Bay, what the key is here is that they were doing all this, massive amounts of geospatial, studies, and not just Nearmap and Aviation were doing their stuff, but there were other companies that were doing, specifically focusing on forestry, and the forestry stuff was to kind of basically predict where the slash damage would go. So this was being done. It was being paid for at the government level. It was also other geospatial projects were being paid for at the council level, and yet none of that starter material was flitting its way down to the to the public arena, so that we're available to wear it. So people didn't know that they didn't know that area was going to be hit by forestry slash, but the industry did. And that's, again, a really critical point. Like, why are we paying for this geospatial money if it's not actually benefiting, it's only benefiting big business, who, in this case, certain areas, housing development that shouldn't have been built, that council let them build, storm drains that should have been built in certain areas that weren't. So, again, in kind of the Nelson area, what I'm saying is like going, okay, I understand why you let the Cobb Dam off. You didn't want flooding; it was going to have a backfit. I get it, but you also knew that the weather conditions were going to be taking place in 4 or 5 days. So why weren't you letting it off 4 or 5 days over a controlled leash instead of waiting till like when the storm actually occurred? And actually, Civil Defence hadn't delivered any sandbags to there, and they still don't have any sandbags. So then another one comes through. We're actually really vulnerable. All this knowledge available for collecting geospatial technology, and yet it's actually no practical applications are taken from this technology, which is designed specifically to be mitigating the effects of extreme weather events, which are also backed up by things like Scion, which is a big, almost kind of like half private, half public, and that's the danger. Keyword here is half privatised, half public. Looks at things like carbon and forestry and so on. And these guys have access to big supercomputers that can crack huge amounts of information. But again, none of this information is hitting boots on ground. And so eventually they go, oh, we're not going to insure anybody, or you're going to have to walk off your land. So then people walk off their land because they can't get any insurance, because basically they haven't been given any outdated information from all this collected technology. Who's going to walk in and buy that land for a fraction of the price and then turn around and create a food monopoly where they can spray what do they want? Because now the regulatory authorities say, oh, don't worry about that. We're now in New Zealand, and we've even changed the laws now. So we actually basically let the Northern Hemisphere, and I'm generalising here, so don't hoist me on a pinata, but we're effectively allowing the Northern Hemisphere, where we know that the lobbyists already are actually controlling the governments in the European Union, to decide what food and health. That's the problem. I want to say he's the president of Ag Pharma and DuPont, Christie. I can't remember his first name, but he was doing an article talking about the TPA. He said after the TPA is great, science will be great because now we can push our version of science. I didn't know there were versions of science, but in this case, what he actually means is we can push the one where the lobbyists are saying to people, well, if you want any funding, you're going to jump through the hoops that we put through, and if you don't, well, there's no funding for you, and you get marginalised, and basically you may as well not have a career in academia because you're not going to go anywhere. That's what we're up against. And okay, lastly, the Bulletin of Atomic Science was talking about the impact about cloud changing, and in that particular element, they also talked about the case of 1957, where they were testing early on, and it caused the flooding in a village. So we've got the case in Tasmania, we've got the cases in Dubai, we've got the cases in Vietnam, we've got the cases in the UK, 4 cases at least, where we know that actually cloud seeding did actually cause flooding. And even again, when you look at I think it's Antena de Ricos, Rainmaker, the company that Peter Thiel is, you read his word and he's trying to deny it and say, oh no, that wasn't us. But then you read the fine minutiae, and he says, oh, it's actually very unpredictable. Well, okay, if it's unpredictable, then why are you actually go back to South Australia? So again, we know that it was taking place. We know that they suspended the operations in 2024. Now they say it was because it was financial. The history about snow hydros, it actually goes all the way back to the original dam that was built there, which was overseen by Colonel Professor Thomas Leach, Dean of Engineering, in charge of Project SEAL, which was creating a man-made tsunami, which worked very effectively. Because again, it was about the thermodynamics. Was that what he realised was when you drop a bomb in the water, it just goes plop. But if you drop a series of explosive charges, each charge would lead into each other. And so when you apply that not just to water but to electromagnetics, again, it's about the question of when they say, oh no, they can't do that, there's not enough power. There is if you wind things up like a rubber band and let it off. And also in the case of when you're talking about things like HARP, it's like it's not actually the machine on the ground is not causing the weather. It's just simply interacting with existing electromagnetic phenomena, which they'll monitor the sun. There's a solar storm. They know that the bow shock of that's going to be powerful. They could coincide with other particular events that they know will all ramp up that effect, and they'll target an area using electromagnetic spectrums. They go, right, that area we know is now active, bang, target there, target a knownly active seismic area. That can and it's about leverage. I'm slightly going off topic, but Alexander Kuzmov was a Russian guy. Vulcan was one of the projects, but if you go and it took me a long time to dig his stuff up, because every time it comes out, it gets buried, and you have to really work through like that link. And I was going through the stuff on Polarstern today, and all the links on the actual pages were all broken, and I don't think that was entirely intentional. And actually, the little thing came up saying something's fishy here, which I thought was quite funny. But went around that by like copying and pasting the titles and then putting them that way, and then the articles would come up and I'd get the data. But you had to do a lot of deep diving to get that not the armchair Sherlock Holmes, Google, oh, every single cloud is a chemtrail. I'm talking about getting in to get that scholarly based material that's being peer reviewed and actually has people who are looking at it who actually have an understanding of the chemistry and the science. And when you do look at all that stuff, it's quite alarming. And amongst all the people that are saying actually this technology could alleviate climate issues, it could also equally cause them. And one of the issues is in the case of the Polarstern operations that they're carrying out, was they were saying, well, this actually could cause an algae bloom condition. And they explained about the little falling down, the animals, little microscope animals digesting it, they die, they rot, they release toxic bloom. So what we have effectively in South Australia is we have an area where there is cloud seeding going on. There lots of it, not just 1 or 2 operations. Like we've got 12 different based by ships. We've got operations, referral to academic projects of this taking place on the Antarctic, which is just mind-boggling, because that actually I don't even know that's actually legal. And then we also have obviously these operations taking place in Australia, which go from 2024 all the way back to the 1940s. And then suddenly they say, oh no, we don't have the money to do that, even though actually you used money for years from the budget from the snow hydro, which also was used, the black budget from that was used to actually create Australia's short-term nuclear program. So suddenly that's saying financial, and there's very little bit like, oh, there could be a few environmental concerns. And then you read into that, and then it's like, well, actually, it's affecting the biodiversity, but doesn't tell you why. But I'm suggesting because someone's actually realised these things actually do have. It's basically the other. When you want to look up, is go and look up nanoparticles and toxic algae, and then you'll see the correlation between that. These things are actually known to actually cause it. So anyway, that's my little thought process on today. Is that again, what we're having is a really frustrating time, because there are people out there that will turn around and they'll talk all sorts of nonsense about cloud seeding because they want to fit all the patterns together, and they're not helping. They don't do any scientific study. They're more interested in the fear porn than actually understanding the actual work. And on the other hand, we've got journalists that are lazy, that are taking it from organisations that have been largely politicalised. And I like to consider myself an environmentalist. I'm not opposed to the idea. My attitude is actually about climate change is only one of the issues that we need to focus on. There's pesticides, there is pollutions. These are effectively what they've done is they've taken all the green and put it all into climate change. Oh, we take care of that, then we magically make the world make a better place. That's not the issue. The issue is industrialization of mankind is killing this planet. That is not up for argument's sake. But when you have organisations that are so fearful that you suggest any suggestion of this technology has a detrimental effect, and they go, oh no, because there's millions of dollars, billions of dollars of funding, then they're not applying with the level of science. They're applying because there is a political agenda. And again, the key thing here is it's combined. It's media who are being lazy, talking to academics that already have a vested interest, but also, generally speaking, not the specific experts that they should be talking to, but they don't want to admit that because, again, it's you've ever talked to academics, and I have 2 degrees, by the way, but I do find it always funny that there seems the higher you up you get, the more this assumption occurs that they must be the cleverest person in the room and that they know about everything, when the reality is they don't. They know they're experts on their field, and unfortunately, somewhere along the world of academia, we've lost the humility to understand that a master of one thing does not make you a master of all things. Anyway, that's been my little thoughts today about the whole issue that we're facing on this area, and it's, my frustration is we have serious environmental issues, but we have science that is actually really narrow-minded. It doesn't really look very closely at where its sourcing funding comes from, and as a result of that, is what we're actually getting out is a very controlled, abject version of it. And when it comes to looking at wanting to know what the consequence, like GMO is a classic example. It's not that I'm anti-GMO, but we still don't have any of the questions about what the long-term consequences are. But because there is money to be made and there's funding available, people are rushing out going, oh, no, don't worry about that. We'll sort it out in the long run. Radiation has kind of shown us, along with thalidomide, along with tobacco, along with plastics, along with PCBs, that's probably not a good way to go. That's not a really very scientific way to just pump and dump. But effectively, that's what we're doing.